The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ERA's webinar for Best Practices for Successful Participation in DMRQA for Microbiology. My name is Mike Blades, and I will be your presenter today. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few basic ground rules for today's webinar. All of you are in listen-only mode, and if you have any questions, please type them into the question box on your webinar control panel. I will hold off answering these questions until the conclusion of the presentation. If I don't have time to cover them all, we will go ahead and answer those via an email that we will send to you at the conclusion of the webinar. It is being recorded today, and the webinar itself will actually be posted on the website. I'll also create a PDF of the slides, and we'll send those to all the registered participants. I also wanted to let you know that we have 2 more scheduled webinars coming up soon. One will be next week, March 20th. This will be for DMRQA PH. And then we'll do another one next month, April 17th, on DMRQA data reporting. So as I mentioned, my name is Mike Blades. I'm a technical manager here at ERA for organics and microbiology. I've been with ERA for a little over 25 years now. Tell you a little bit about ERA. We were founded back in 1977, originally in Arvada, Colorado. We're now located in Golden. We do business with more than 7,000 laboratories in more than 80 countries. Our facility has about 25,000 square feet of space that's dedicated towards manufacturing and laboratory. We produce a variety of products, microbiology, wastewater, drinking water, soil, air and emissions, radiochemistry, and custom standards. We hold a number of accreditations, ISO 17034, which is as a CRM manufacturer, ISO 17043, which is specifically for PT providers conducting interlab studies, ISO 17025, which is a testing and calibration laboratory. We have an ISO 9001 quality management system, and we're accredited to the TNI NELAP Volume 3 requirements. Okay, the agenda for today, before we go through all of them, I really wanted to give you guys an idea on our intent with this presentation really is to share a lot of the experience that ERA has gained over the years, conducting PT studies and working with the participants specifically for microbiology. We really believe that the keys to acceptable results for the participants are really understanding how the sample needs to be designed and evaluated by the PT provider. It needs to be an easy and convenient to use product. You need to have good execution of the method, and then you need to have careful reporting of results. So with that in mind, we're going to start out with going over the TNI NELAP sample design and evaluation criteria. We'll go over the ERA specific sample design. We'll go over general quality control. We'll cover some common methods for best practices and some pitfalls that you want to avoid. We will go over reporting results, available resources, and then we'll cover questions at the end. All right, so let's start out with the requirements for the sample design that were given by TNI. Basically, we're required to produce a single quantitative sample that contains specifically E. coli in the range of 20 to 2400 CFU or MPN per mil. There are 3 analytes, essentially, that we're required to cover that are covered by 2 technologies. So total coliforms, fecal coliforms, and E. coli by membrane filtration and then by most probable number. The acceptance criteria that we have to follow is all done in log transformed participant mean and standard deviation. The PTRLs for these products are 2 CFU per 100 mil or 2 MPN per 100 mil. Now the statistics are pretty involved, but we have done a webinar previously on that called Understanding the Evaluation of Micro Results for Proficiency Testing that you can access through the website. It'll go into a lot of the details on how we actually are required to handle the data sets. So if you're interested in that, that information is available for you. So the actual way that the information is communicated to us via T&I is through what are called fields of proficiency testing tables. Now those tables come to us in basically an Excel spreadsheet format where it lists out those specific analytes and the technologies, the ranges, the fact that it needs to be log transformed, and that it's going to be plus or minus 3 standard deviations. You can access this also through our website, and there are NELAC FoPT tables set up for not only non-potable water, but drinking water, soil and hazardous material, radiochemistry, and so forth. All right. So any discussion when you're talking about a PT sample in the design, I think you need to start out by kind of recognizing that microsamples are kind of unique in the PT world in that you're analyzing organisms that are going to change. So there are pretty strict requirements when it comes to transporting the sample and the amount of time that can elapse before you have to actually get the analysis started. So I'm quoting some info out of 40 CFR here just to put that into perspective. The next thing that you really need to be aware of is that under our ISO 17043 accreditation, when it comes to designing a sample, especially one where the evaluation is going to be based on the participant mean and standard deviation, is that you need to assure that you can provide every participant with a comparable test item. So whether you get the sample at the beginning of the study or at the end of the study, those need to be comparable test items. The other consideration is they need to obviously remain stable throughout that time frame. So given that the nature of microorganisms and the necessity of the sample design being needed to require this stability over a wide range of shipping conditions and study time intervals, currently there are really only 3 formats that are provided by approved providers. Those are whole volume, dehydrated samples, and lyophilized samples. So we're going to go through those one at a time just to give you an idea of what it is those are. So let's start with whole volumes. Whole volumes are essentially a quantitative inoculation of cultured target organisms that are spiked into a stabilizing media. The sample will then get aliquoted out into all of the various sample portions, and that's what goes out to the customer. So what is this stabilizing media? Essentially, it's a slightly acidic hypertonic salt solution. What this solution does, it actually limits the water availability of the organism by preventing the water from entering the cell. And this will give you a short-lived stabilizing effect. The shelf life on this kind of product is really measured in a few weeks at best. And what you need to be aware of is the organism begins to change as soon as it's inoculated into this type of sample. And it will become more and more difficult to recover with the passage of time until eventually the organisms will become unrecoverable. Really what is happening here is there, with the cell wall, there's an osmotic effect that actually will, alter the actual size of the organism. They start to shrivel up. So this type of sample will be very time and temperature sensitive. Back when they first privatized the PT program, the EPA put out a criteria document that PT providers were required to follow. And one of the statements in there, it actually talked about this type of a sample. Organisms pre-inoculated in a liquid matrix should be performed only during certain time frames. When you don't think you're going to have a lot of heat or a lot of cool temperatures, and you really want the customer to analyze the sample within a pretty quick time frame after it's prepared. So this was very limiting. The next type of sample is a dehydrated sample. Now, this is an improvement over whole volumes, but there are still limitations. It's essentially an inoculum of organisms that you place in a water-soluble solution, and then you dry it under pretty controlled conditions, but you're removing the water by evaporation and sometimes heat, and that can have some negative effects on the organism. Usually this is presented as a disc that you reconstitute in a solution when you're ready to use it. It also can be pretty temperature sensitive. A lot of that is related to when you try to remove the water by evaporation, you're not going to be able to fully remove all of it. So it can create some sensitivity. So usually these products are required to ship overnight, or they need to be by some kind of expedited service, and they're usually done on ice. The long-term storage on these products is usually in a freezer. The shelf life generally runs in the neighborhood of 12 to 18 months. It's water soluble, but these products can be kind of difficult to dissolve. When you dry them, they'll kind of form a skin on them, and it's kind of difficult to get it into solution. The other type of sample is the sample that's been lyophilized. So lyophilization is kind of an improvement on both of the previous processes in that it's an inoculum of organisms that you preserve using a low temperature dehydration process, which involves freezing the product, lowering the pressure, and then you remove any of the ice that formed by sublimation. So generally this will create a sample that has long-term stability measured in terms of years. Short-term stability, shipping stability, can be done at ambient temperatures with a product like this. It also can be produced using very water-soluble materials. It can be very quick dissolving. So when you do this process, it also preserves a lot of the natural characteristics of the organisms. This is actually a technique that is preferred by a lot of the national culture collections for storage of their bacteria. If you ever buy anything from ATCC, this is the format you're generally going to get it. Lyophilization of the microorganisms was also a technique that was used by the EPA prior to privatization for their proficiency testing program. All right, so with those choices in mind, ERA really thought to produce a product that we can deliver an equivalent sample to all of the participants. We can maximize that shelf life. ERA made a choice that we would move towards a lyophilized product. So our product shows up as a lyophilized pellet with a rehydration fluid. The pellet contains E. coli. Specifically, we use ATCC 51813 at the certified value or within the manufacturing range stated by T&I. The expiration date on the product is set at 2 years. We ship the sample at ambient temperature by generally the customer's desired shipping service. So that may be overnight if they want it, or it may be ground. We also send these samples worldwide because our participation involves folks from other countries. Once you receive the pellet, you store it at 4 degrees C. The hydration, you store at room temp. You really rehydrate the sample on your time frame, on when you want to actually run your method and report your results. So it's focused around you. The hydration process is really simple, quick, and convenient. Also, one thing that should be noted, related to this 2-year expiration period. It gives us the ability to produce many lots at a variety of concentrations that are available basically at any given point in time. So we do about 13 lots a year or more. So what this will allow you to do is supplemental PTs are really available whenever you need them. You can use these products for method validations, demonstration of capabilities. You can use them to evaluate your culture media performance. You can use them as just routine reference cultures, regular QCs. So to kind of show you how easy it is for the sample to be rehydrated, we put together a little video here for you. So as I'd mentioned, the buffer solution, you leave that at room temperature all the time. The pellet, you store it at 4 degrees C just because that, is the best storage. Bring it out, warm it up to room temperature, generally half an hour, or a little longer if it really isn't that critical. And then rehydration really is just aseptically transfer the pellet over to the buffer solution. You can do that in any way you feel comfortable. I'm comfortable with just pouring it. You can see that the pellet really starts to dissolve upon contact. And you don't need to do much, but just a quick swirl. Now at that point, that represents your PT sample. It's ready to start doing your normal test. So let's now, since you understand basically the criteria and ERA sample design, how to use it, let's talk about some general quality control. Let's start with sterility checks. Laboratories really need to be performing sterility checks for the procedures that are in use. And generally, it's for all of the things that are going to be involved in that particular procedure. So for like membrane filtration, you want to check the sterility, obviously, of your media, the filters, the pads, the buffer dilution water that you would be using to dilute the sample, pipettes that you may use, flask, your dish. Basically everything that potentially could be a source of contamination, you need to demonstrate that it's not introducing anything. If you're doing multiple tube procedures, again, same thing. You want to check the sterility of all of the apparatus that's involved. You also want to make sure that when you bring in new lots of any of these things, you want to make sure that you've demonstrated it again. Just because one lot of pipettes demonstrates that they're sterile, you want to make sure that they all are. Okay, so the next big thing related to control is you want to run positive controls. Every new batch of media and the method apparatus, you want to check your analytical procedure by testing positive controls to demonstrate that the media produces the expected reaction under test. E. coli is a good strain for most of the methods that you guys are doing for DMR. Manufacturers may have recommendations of controls that they want you to use. You may want to use the control that's being used for the proficiency testing program. You need to decide that. The other issue that you want to confirm for your positive controls, you need to ensure the identity and the traceability of what you're using for that positive control. You can purchase reference materials from recognized collections. There's lots of companies that produce traceable organisms that are traceable back to the original national collection. Or you can get them from like a manufacturer that's actually accredited to some of these standards. So like our QC samples would work fine for this purpose. The other thing related to the positive controls is they could be single use or they could be cultures that are maintained within your laboratory. But if you do that, you want to make sure that you're doing everything to maintain the purity and the viability of the organism if you're doing passages. You don't want to use the same, culture that you've been freezing and thawing, and you potentially could run into issues with the organism actually changing. So often you will want to limit how many times you can pass it. Negative controls. So you've got your positive control to show you the reaction that you are expecting. You want to run negative controls to show that the media that you're using or your process doesn't show that typical response, that it gives you a negative result. There's a variety of different organisms that you can select for this. We sell some in our products. Proteus could be used, Pseudomonas. There's a variety of different species. So, and again, for this, you want to ensure the identity and traceability of the reference culture that you're using. Either get it from a recognized national collection or organization or a manufacturer that's recognized by an accrediting authority. And again, they can be single use or they can be cultures that you're maintaining. So let's talk about method evaluation. You should demonstrate that all methods that are in use in the laboratory are evaluated for their ability to produce acceptable results before they're first used. For quantitative micro methods, you can accomplish this by either participating in a PT program or getting a quality control sample. Hydration of the lyophilized pellet. The hydration of the lyophilized pellet really needs to be done with the buffer solution or the hydration fluid that's provided and by the instructions that we provide. I want to point out that this is a peer-to-peer evaluation. You're being evaluated against everyone else running this sample. You need to make sure that the way you rehydrate it is consistent with everyone that's participating in the study. So if you deviate from that, since that assigned value and acceptance interval are going to be based on all of the participants' data, you want to avoid going off script, so to speak. Now, once the hydration of the pellet is complete, you should perform your analysis then. You've got 30 minutes, maybe a little more. The organisms aren't going to go into a growth phase right away. We really just don't want you to rehydrate it, pop it in the fridge, go to lunch. You really want to handle it fairly, timely after you reconstitute the sample. It's quantitative, so you don't want to have any growth or death or any issue that's going to put you at a disadvantage. You also want to remember, you want to gently shake the sample prior to taking your aliquot. If you have specifics in your procedure saying how many times you shake it, do your normal process. Okay, let's go on to general quality control. So culture media, the quality of the culture media is probably one of the most critical aspects of running these samples. If you're making it from dehydrated media, you want to follow the instructions closely. Always check the pH, make sure you make any adjustments. You also want to evaluate the media after you've made it up. Make sure that this batch of media is at least as good as the last batch of media. Never use the media outside of an expiration date. If you've somehow managed to store it in a way that was not recommended by the manufacturer, don't use the media. Their expiration dates, all of that information is based on you following the instructions. Confirm that the prepared media is actually made to the appropriate recipe in the method. Generally, this should be taken for granted, but you may want to double check. Make sure that the manufacturer is actually following the prescribed recipe. Dilution water and rinse water. To perform dilutions and apparatus rinsing, you don't want to use DI water. You want to use phosphate buffer or peptone water. It's not uncommon for DI or distilled water to have inhibitory effects. You can reference standard methods, and that'll actually give you the recipe to how to make it up. You can buy the media already pre-made by manufacturers. Also, if you're doing any kind of dilutions, like with a Color Alert product, and the manufacturer has recommendations for what's used for their product dilutions, follow their instructions. Thermometers. Thermometers, you need to make sure that they are graduated in the appropriate increment for the analysis being performed. You need to make sure that they've been checked against certified NIST thermometers. If That gives you any kind of correction factor. You want to make sure that you're using them. Water baths. Water baths, it's really important, since the tolerance on the method is very tight, that you monitor it closely. Generally, you're going to be checking it at least a couple of times during the days that you're using it, about 4 hours apart. The stability and the uniformity of the temperature distribution is really important. Often you want to have a gabled cover on the top. You want to have a circulator in the water bath. You want to make sure that that incubator isn't sitting anywhere where it could be affected by diffusers for your air conditioner or your heater. If the temperature starts jumping around, it can cause you a problem with your analysis. Air incubators. Again, you need to be verifying the temperature is within the appropriate tolerance. Things with air incubators that you want to be aware of as well. Different shelves in the air incubator potentially can have different temperatures. You want to make sure that it's fairly uniform. Large incubators of this type can have some problems. You also want to check that when you open the incubator door and you close it, how long does it take to refresh back to the appropriate incubation temperature? You don't want to get in and out of that incubator a lot when you're running your samples. So membrane filtration best practices. You need to make sure on these products that you're doing dilution schemes. Generally with membrane filtration methods, you're trying to get to an ideal count. It may be 20 to 80 or 20 to 60, depending on what your target organism is. You know that the sample is going to be somewhere within that range of 20 to 2400, at least that's where it's been designed. So you want to make sure that you do dilutions that are going to give you a good shot at hitting those ranges. We also recommend that you run the entire volume of the sample. Don't just run 50 mils of it. You actually want to run dilution portions so you can consume the entire volume. All right, so an example of a dilution scheme, 50, 30, 12, 5, 2, 1. It's just a number of volumes that kind of would potentially give you counts that would fall within those ideal counting range, whether the sample was in the high portion of the range or the low portion of the range. So always dilute the sample, always use the entire volume. You also want to be careful when you do your volumes. Make sure that you're either bringing that volume back up to 100 mils so that you get good dispersion of the organisms through your filter, or you're at least using 20 or 30 mils or so. If you don't get a plate that falls in the ideal counting range, I would recommend that you go to Standard Methods 9222B, Section 6. It'll give you information that you need to be able to calculate your result using all of the plates that you ran. So let's talk about filter paper. Filter paper should be a 0.45 micron. That's really the most common used. It's very appropriate for coliform bacteria given their size. If the filter paper is somehow defective, you're going to see a couple of things associated with that. You may get colony development at the grid lines that is abnormal. You may get poor or absent colony sheening on the surface when you're dealing with like M-endo. You could have brittleness with the filter. It also could have wrinkling. Also, there may be areas without good absorption. You may see a little bit of difference in the color in the actual filter laying on the pad. Another way to check them is you can float them on reagent water. They should diffuse within about 15 seconds. If they continue to float and they never absorb, chances are there's something wrong with that filter paper. All right, let's talk about media broth for broth and pad. Pads should always retain 1.8 to 2.2 mils of broth. You can measure that using if you're getting an ampule that contains the media, you can measure the volume in it with a syringe, put it back into the container, put it on the pad, measure the volume that doesn't absorb by the pad, calculate the difference between the two. It really should fall within that range. If your pad doesn't, then it's probably not absorbent enough and you may want to consider looking at that. Another method-specific issue that I want to talk about is people doing what's now standard method 9222J, or MCully Blue. MCully Blue, when you're doing it in the broth and pad format, the manufacturer has some pretty specific information called out related to the pads that they recommend that you use. And they say if you don't use those ones that are recommended, you can get unreliable or inaccurate data. From our experience, we've seen using the Millipore EO sterilized pad seem to produce the most consistent results. Application of the filter. Poor contact on the filter pad. You need to make sure that you're getting good contact. If you're not getting good contact between the two, you're not going to get a good uptake of the media through the filter to the organisms. The way you can achieve really the best contact with these is by rolling it onto the pad, edge to edge. Also, you can give it a good tap once you have the Petri dish lid on the top of a bench. It'll help to firm up the contact between the filter and the pad. Now some issues related to Quantatray or Quantatray 2000. Quantatray within their, IDEX within their procedural notes has a comment saying use sterile non-buffered oxidant-free water for dilutions. This statement should not be applied to the hydration instructions for the PT sample. The instructions that they're giving you there really only pertain to any dilutions that you would do on that PT sample that you've created or the real world sample. It doesn't pertain to the hydration dilutions, rehydration. So make sure you don't not use the buffer because it potentially will cause you some issues. If you're using a Quantatray 51 well, remember that that only goes up to 200 MPN per 100 mils. So given the range of 20 to 2400, you're going to need to do dilution so that you cover all the possibilities that the PT could be at. Quantatray 2000, that's a 97 well. It goes up to 2419 with a 100 mil sample. But be aware, the confidence interval associated with that 2419 is fairly wide, meaning that if the sample is actually made at, say, 1800, you could potentially expect with an 1800 that you may get a number that may max out that Quantatray. So you really don't want to get into that situation. So we would recommend that you do dilutions. Other issues related to Quantatray. Add the test reagent to the diluted sample. Don't dilute the sample and then add, add the test reagent to the diluted sample. You don't want to add it to the sample and then do dilutions. The whole MPN test is based on a certain concentration of the color alert reagent. So you need to make sure that you follow that. Also, don't forget to do any kind of dilution factor, incorporate that into your MPN value. The other issue, read interpretation. For color alert systems, understand that there are read windows, 18 to 22 hours or 24 to 28 hours. Really what that's saying is that a result that still turns positive within that window is still considered a positive. Comparators. If comparators are available, you definitely want to use those. Color Alert has it. It's a very slight yellow. You want to make sure that you're looking at that side by side with your Quantatray. So multiple tube fermentation dilution schemes. Generally, people are running in 15 tubes, doing a 10-1 and a 0.1. If you're doing that, that only takes you up to 1600. You want to make sure that you add an additional 5 replicates and do that 0.01 so that you can expand the range. Degassing of broth. To avoid any kind of false positives, You want to make sure that you're degassing your media broth. Often it can dissolve oxygen, and when you're warming it up to the incubation temperature, that can outgas into your Durham tube, and that does not represent a positive reaction. You want to make sure that you either warm up the tubes, get the gas out before you inoculate them, or once you do inoculate them, come back to the incubator after about 30 minutes, outgas, put it back in the incubator. You don't want to have an interpretation of a small gas bubble that is really degassing of the broth to cause you to get a false positive. Broth concentrations for MPN. You want to make sure that you're using the appropriate strength, single strength, double strength. It depends on the amount of sample you're going to inoculate into the tube. Make sure that you don't dilute the strength of the broth. This can kind of deviate and cause you low results. If by chance you're someone who is doing cull alert in a 15 tube format, you want to make sure that you follow IDEX's instructions very close. They actually have it set up so that they maintain the appropriate strength within the tubes. Ordering. When you're ordering products from ERA, you need to be aware that multiple tube and multiple well tests are very likely to produce method bimodal distribution by the participants. Folks performing 9223B need to be evaluated separately from those doing 9221B. We sell the product in 2 catalog numbers so that we can keep those data sets straight and the customers are clear. Catalog number 576 should be used by anyone doing membrane filtration for most probable number techniques using multiple well Quantitre. 576A for anybody using the 9221 method, the 15 tube, or doing 9223B cull alert using a 15 tube format. In the very near future, TNI will be updating the non-potable water FoPT table to actually split out the analytes into 9 as opposed to the current 6 to deal with this very issue. But right now, just make sure you order the right part number. Reporting issues. So we're going to go over some of the reporting issues. You want to make sure that you do not report using alpha characters. All alpha characters such as non-detects, BDLs, TN, TC, those are going to be given a no evaluation. For reporting membrane filtration results, if you report a greater than, it's going to be evaluated as non-acceptable. For reporting MPN results, reported with a greater than, we'll score it as that value. That is our current practice, but be aware the 2006 TNI standard will require us to evaluate all greater than as not acceptable. So everything I've been telling you about dilutions, it's going to become really significant for next year. But this year, I want you to avoid it, but you're going to be evaluated as the number associated with that greater than. If you leave results blank, that analyte will be given an evaluation as not reported. All right, so for analytes, report the date the sample was analyzed and report your method. If you don't do that, we're still going to evaluate your results, but it may come back to you when you report the information off to your accrediting body. They want to see when was it done, what was the method. Only report values for each analyte that you're seeking an evaluation and were determined by the method that you are actually using. We're not allowed to make any assumptions or interpretations of the results that you report. So example, what I'm talking about there, if you were to report to us that you ran 9222D, but you reported a result for total coliforms, generally those two things aren't associated with each other, but we have no way of knowing, did you report the wrong method or the wrong analyte? So try to keep it straight. Only report the method associated with the analyte that it determined. Other people, another example would be you ran 9223B, but you reported it as a membrane filtration method. Or you ordered the 576, but you reported the result as a method that was associated with 576A. So if you're analyzing using membrane filtration, keep in mind that evaluation limits will be as whole numbers. If you're analyzing a sample using a most probable number method, the evaluation limits will be to 3 significant figures. If you go to an MPN table and it has more than 3 significant figures, you can report them, but remember, we will stop at 3 significant figures. It may affect how you maybe round the number or don't round the number, but just be aware that those limits will be 3 sig figs. I now wanted to cover some additional resources that you can get through ERA's website at ERAQC.com. You can get a copy of all of the NELAC FoPT tables. We also have a variety of webinars on a number of DMRQA topics that have been recorded from previous years, covering BOD, pH, solids, reporting and corrective action. We also have CRMs for all of your DMRQA needs, not only microbiology, but wet, solids, oil and grease, pH, mercury, pretty much everything that you're going to need associated with DMR. We also have an FAQ that's available. So a lot of frequently asked questions associated with DMRQA, they're already listed there and answered on the website. We also have a glossary of terms. A lot of acronyms are used. The study is called DMRQA, so you would expect a lot of acronyms. So we've got all of those spelled out on the website as well. We also have an order form for you for all the products that you may need. Technical support, 1-800-372-0122. Call the general information line. Tell them that you're interested in technical support, specifically for microbiology, and we have a number of people that are going to be able to help you here. You also can contact me directly, either by email or my direct telephone line. I also wanted to let you know orders. You can place orders either on the website, you can do it by email, or you can call and we will connect you to one of our customer service folks. So that really concludes the slide deck portion of the presentation today. And now we're going to take questions. And we will take a look here to see if we've got any. And it looks like we do, but hold on one second. So when does the study open? Well, at this point, to the best of my knowledge, the EPA letter either has not been sent out yet or has not been received. We've not seen it. We generally are notified about the same time that you are. We've looked at EPA's website. We're not seeing anything there at this point. But we believe that this all is going to happen very shortly, either maybe later this week or next week. Our current plan is we will be opening the study on March 22nd and closing it July 19th. Okay. So what is the normal pass-fail rate? Well, keep in mind that fail rate is going to be study and analyte specific. So it's going to vary a little bit, but generally speaking, across all of the various analytes, it runs at about 3 to 5%, or you'll see one customer out of about 20 that'll fail. We keep a running average of it that actually is available on the website. When it closes, you can go to eData, which is going to be covered in a future webinar related to the reporting. And you'll be able to see all of your data at the close of the study, and you'll be able to see the failure rate that was specific to the study you participated and for the analyte you reported. All right. What happens if I don't pass? Well, generally you're going to have to demonstrate some type of corrective action. But that corrective action really can vary depending on who you're reporting the results to and what they require. I have seen corrective action be anything from you need to give some type of a written response to why the failure occurred. You may potentially need to run a QC sample and communicate your result from the QC sample onto your accreditation body, or you may have to go down the road of actually participating in another study. It really just depends on what's required with your AB. We're going to have an option regardless of what you're required to do here, whether it's QC or another study or a quick response. Sometimes that may be an option, but any of those will be available through ERA. So really, we have many other questions that have been submitted that we are running a little bit tight on time. And what we're going to do is print all of those out, and then I'll go through and I'll give a response to all of those. And then we will PDF those. And when we send out the slide deck to the registered participants, we will send out a copy of that as well. All right, so that concludes today's webinar. I just wanted to thank everyone here for your time. I know that it's very valuable. I hope you got some information out of the presentation that you'll find useful, that you maybe will be able to apply when you participate in this year's study. But again, thank you very much. We appreciate your business, and we are here if you have any kind of questions, and we will assist you in whatever way possible. So thank you very much, and that concludes today's webinar.